Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Professor and the Carpenter, the brand new show from the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis, where my friend Carlos Garrido and I will discuss the Marxist view on everything from education to zoo animals. I don't know. I pulled that one out of my, and it didn't quite work. Anyway, we'll be discussing the Marxist view of all kinds of different things. This evening, we're going to be going over the recent debate that I had with anti-communist activist Drew Pavlou. We'll be finishing up annihilating Lyin James Lindsey. And I guarantee you at least 3 people will ask us where Eddie is. And all that will be going on right after this. All right, we're back. How are you today, Carlos?
I'm doing very well, brother. How about yourself?
Tired. I am incredibly tired. As anyone who's familiar with us knows, we're like 20 minutes out from Noah's bedtime right now. Plus, I've been working outside in the heat all week on some really horrible jobs. So I'm exhausted, but I could not say no to doing a live stream tonight. There's too much to talk about and a lot going on. Yeah, I don't know.
You've been working next to some poison ivy this last week. How's that been?
Awful. Oh, dude, like I have to then wear, carpenter pants rather than shorts or something that would be weather appropriate. So I'm just like me, like knee deep at least, and then waist deep at other times in like poison oak and poison ivy, jumping over all these like logs and trees. It's been horrible. This is the worst fence ever. Plus, it's like after repairing it, I had to stain the entire thing. And it's like over half a mile of fence if you put it back to back, right? And so like I had to like just stay in these. It was bad. There was no way to like get around just sucking the entire week.
And it's so incredibly hot. I don't know what Cleveland it's at right now, but a large chunk of the south of the country has been seeing just consistent triple digits. And the place in Texas I'm at, it's consistently anywhere from 100 to 103, and the feels like temperature goes up to I've seen up to 115. It's the sort of hot where you go outside and it sublates like you'll sweat a lot hot, and it gets into the you better cover yourself up because the skin is gonna hurt if you're a minute outside hot, and that's just horrific. There's nothing to do, and I'm the sort of person I gotta go for my at least twice a day. I gotta go for an hour walk with my wife and walk the dog and stroll the baby and have my conversations, and you just can't do that here. It's so dumb unless you wake up really early or you go out in the night with the coyotes out. Um, it's just so bad, dude.
Yeah, it's not that bad here. We're right on the lake, so like we
Mm.
do get some, but it's still horrible. What you're saying reminds me of. Did you ever watch that old show, Arrested Development? It's like one
Wow.
of the best, funniest TV shows of all time. And there's a scene where Michael, the one main character, like he always pictured that he would like live out the rest of his days in Phoenix for some reason. And he goes to Phoenix and he gets outside and immediately is just like covered in sweat. He tries to touch a car door and burns his hand. Not fun being that hot. Not fun.
No, it's not, man. And yeah, and it's so easy to have like people pushed into like these theaters of consumption, where since there's nothing to do outside because it's hot as balls, you just go to the mall or you go to various places where all there is consume, 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 and you start doing that for 4 or 5 months a year, and uh, you start to transform yourself into the sort of person where happiness comes not from like these good walks and good conversations with people, but from just the consumption that you participate in malls and in wherever you are, because it's all there really is that you can do. You know, it's indoors is the only place you can be nowadays in the summer. So, um, but yeah, I one of the topics we wanted to talk about today was the I don't want to say immiseration, but the very clear, to be humble about it, the very clear victory that you had in the last debate with Drew Pavlou. Um, I think it was clear to anyone that was watching that um, he might be good meaning, he might not, but what he is definitely not is prepared on the subjects that he's very emotional and active about. And um, there was some people in the comments that were talking about why'd you let him keep going off with the story, but I think that was an important component of letting him kind of show what he's working with. And I think anyone watching, uh, it was clear to anyone watching that these positions that he's holding, that he's very emotional about and very active about and very vocal about, they're built on a house of cards that, with asking a few why questions, just comes tumbling down. And we just did last week Plato's Apology, and I had to discuss with my students for the Marxism and the History of Western Philosophy class that we're doing with the Marxism school. We had to discuss the figure of Socrates and what sort of overlaps does Socrates have with modern revolutionaries and the Socratic method and the method of inquiry that it entails and how applicable it might be today. And you just depicted beautifully that method and how these people that claim to have these certain knowledges, you start questioning them, and it just completely collapses because they're built on assumptions that that's how ideology works. It's the unknown knowns, those things that we do not know that we know, but that shape our engagement with our world. And we don't know that it does that. We perceive it as the world itself, but it's really mediated by these ideological assumptions that have been pumped into our heads, through the cultural apparatuses of capitalism, to the point where it's really a painful self-reflective process that's required in order to overcome that, because it means breaking through a lot of the things that have conditioned you to be who you are. And you see that very clearly. He kept on trying to go to his personal story, and if he ever changes, I don't know if he would. And really, that might have been a small part of the purpose of the debate, but the real purpose was to show like people that might think like him, an alternative. But if he ever changes, it's going to have to take the form of like him having a radical transformation of identity, because his identity has been so tied to that anti-communist work that, and you can tell there was really no arguments. It was just going back to like, here's a story from when I was a 17-year-old, and
Right.
he made himself look very bad in that lecture in that debate.
And especially in our era of the internet, and especially how people sort of build their idea of who they are, being in public and based on these political things, it really really works against being able to ever change. And so when you learn you were wrong about something or had made an assumption, you're almost incentive, or not almost, you are incentivized to ignore that completely. And so your ego, and not like, like I'm better than everybody, your ego as in the sense of who you are, right? Your id, if I'm using that correctly, which I don't know, I never read him, but it is sort of pushing you at all times to not learn, to not question, to not ever self-reflect. Because when you do, you kind of find yourself in this position where you're not believing. And what I was trying to pull out with Drew, and what I think happens with him, is he has a very deep belief. Right. And that leads him to, like, he brought up that book by the guy that he liked, right? Ilhan Toti. And all I did was, go, hey, did you ever see if he was lying? That was it. Right. And he hadn't, because he read it. It confirmed his preconception and he went with it. That's all people need. And that's not a good way. If we're actually genuinely going to be working in the real world for real change, we need the real facts, because people are out there lying. And it turned out this guy was lying like crazy. I mean, the guy was advocating violence, teaching people to try to overthrow the government, and organize a lead organizer in a terrorist secession movement. He wasn't just, this guy. The way he described it was, he was a guy asking for very mild reforms, which is literally what every party secretary in the entire Communist Party of China does, like, as a job.
Right. And there's a really long history of far-right extremists, very nationalist thinkers being propped up, or movements being propped up by the West as moderate, right? Once
the famous moderate rebels, remember?
Once terrorist groups start serving their interests, they become moderate rebels and stop being terrorist groups. And the same groups that in Xinjiang have led to a lot of the terrorism, they're rooted in old school Western funding of religious extremism, and the East Turkestan movement, and all these different groups that have just led to a tremendous increase in acts of terrorism. And what the West does is, when it benefits them, call them moderate rebels and talk about how their rights are being violated or whatever. And then when it doesn't, it calls them terrorists, and it wages a war on terrorism that's extremely costly in lives and American taxpayer dollars and pretty much everything.
Yeah, everything today can be traced back to the Sino-Soviet split era, to the revolutionary era itself, the World Uyghur Congress, all sort of snowballs, and that's an NED and many other NGO funded organization that's like an umbrella, right? Over all kinds of difference. They get millions and millions of dollars in money that you and I kick in taxes. Just so we're clear, they take American tax dollars and give it to these extremists. So what they're doing, what they do, it goes all the way back to like the revolution itself. It's founded by, and I forget the guy's name. It's Isa something.
Chiang Kai-shek. You're not talking about Chiang Kai-shek, you're talking about the...
No. But he was a KMT guy. He was in the Kuomintang, and he was like constantly going and lobbying in the U.S. for money, and receiving millions and millions of dollars in funding to fight the Communist Party. And so like this has a history since even before the foundation of the People's Republic of China. There's connections and networks and what's the word I'm looking for? Organizational alliances, I guess, that go way back almost a century now. So like all of that becomes what it is today, and assumptions get built along the way based on the way they present these things.
Precisely, and that forces any proletarian state, any people state, any socialist state to take repercussions. And the method of the West, which is in line with the way that their philosophers view the world, is one that divorces the facts from the factors. So Drew had very clearly, the sentence of these people, and you start from that sentence and from all these assumptions about why it was and the totalitarianism of the Chinese or whatever, and then you project that those assumptions into why it was that happened, and it ends up always being like, oh, it was just these charges are trumped up or these charges are fake, and I think in part is rooted in not just forms of thinking that are gullible to imperialist lies, but a form of chauvinism, form of Western chauvinism and xenophobia that assumes that, oh, that's the Asiatic menace and the Asiatic strong leader that just dominates a whole country, and all the people are just submissive and they all think in the same way and they follow the leader, and here's this brazen warrior and this free thinker that's promoting terrorism in textbooks for like 13 years, and it's absurd. And they do it all over the place. They've done it in Cuba, they've done it with Venezuela, they've done it in Nicaragua, and in the places where they're the most lenient, like Guaido shouldn't be walking around in the streets in Venezuela. I don't think he is any longer, but he should have never been walking. Like a genuine proletarian state, if a guy like that were to arise, he either would be arrested or excommunicated or something. But the Venezuelans allowed him to stay, and when he would go to the poorer neighborhoods in Venezuela that are very in favor of Chavismo because they've had their living standards lifted, and they were throwing chairs at him. Which authoritarian and totalitarian state police goes there to protect them? It's the Venezuelans. So, and yet the West continues with this narrative about Venezuela or about Cuba or Nicaragua, whatever the case might be. So it's something that's expected. And, one of the things that I would have added, because the term dictatorship came up, and he referenced it, I think, in relation to democratic people's dictatorship, which is a phrase that's in the Constitution. And that's why it's so clear it's so necessary to clear up the dialectics of democracy and dictatorship. You cannot have proletarian democracy or an all people's democracy, right? If you don't have the capacity for that people to have the instruments of dictatorship in repressing its class enemies that would like to infringe on their democracy and on their freedoms. And it's really idealist and divorced from the real world to think that you just have pure democracy on one side and pure dictatorship on the other side, and people either fall in one or in the other. And it's absolutely absurd. What you actually have is, in one side, you have a dictatorship of capital, a democracy for the various splits in the capitalist class to choose what puppet they want running the empire for the next 4 to 8 years. And then on the other side, you have a dictatorship of the people, where they're able to suppress capital and if it exists, make it serve its needs, and it manifests itself through a richer, broader, and more profound democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to really start explaining theory to him. I actually began the conversation and I was going to, and then I stopped myself. I was like, you know what? Never mind. But what I was trying to constantly bring it back to how Chinese democracy works, because all of his narratives only line up if you already have all of his preconceptions, right? And me not like going in there, it seems absurd when when he things that seem to make perfect sense to him are brought up, because I don't have those same preconceptions, right? I've actually looked into how the whole process, people's democracy, functions in reality. So for me to believe this is some repressive dictatorship apparatus is just absolutely ridiculous, right? But because he's never looked into that, he's just believed, then he can easily believe all this other stuff, right? And that's why he kept going to like his personal story of how he got there, which, I don't know if we can believe or not, but that doesn't really matter, right? What matters is the truth. And if things happen even remotely the way he says they do, there's contradictions there that don't add up to how reality functions, right? And I was trying to do one other thing. And I want to say, first of all, that I already respect the guy more than I respect James Lindsey and Jordan Peterson and all these other anti-communists, because they run screaming like terrified little kids from an actual conversation with somebody that, works for an institute like Midwestern Marx, right? But at least he was a man and stood by what he was saying, even when what he was saying was being kind of poked at and shown to be not really how things are, But I was trying to go back and back and back to, let's talk about Chinese democracy. Let's actually see how these things function. And that's one of the things I noticed they do a lot, and this is how they hook kids like Drew, is what I always call a lie through language. They just use words, and that's not even the point of that they're making. They'll just use it offhandedly, like, oh, Xi Jinping's dictatorship did this, this, and this, right? Well, so the this, and this is the actual point. But you're like, hold on a minute. We got to get past this dictatorship thing first. And so I'm trying to like make him actually, let's go in and see if what you're saying will add up rather than blowing by it. Because, I mean, no offense to the guy, I don't really care too much about this protest or his paper he wrote when he was 17.
And as I had never followed him, I found out about it when you told me you had the debate. That's when I looked him up on Twitter. But it was kind of sad. It felt like a younger guy that had some maturing to do, because he's so fixated in like the stuff he was doing when he was 17. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of development there. So that's very tragic. But
well, especially the way things. Oh, before we get to that, I just want to say, especially the way we were just talking about how pro-publicity and how people form who they are, that makes it hard. And it really, really, really pisses me off that this kind of thing happens to so many people. Like, provided he's not lying and cynical about everything, which, we got to be honest, that's a possibility. But if he is just this innocent kid that got wrapped up into this, people in his country are suffering right now. And it takes them away. This kid who has all this energy to do all this activism could be working for something genuinely good. But instead, that energy gets diverted into this, which serves only the ruling class, right? And only warmongers and imperialists, And so provided he's telling the truth, it's very, very sad.
Well, it quite literally serves the enemies of humanity. It's an activist, an activist against humanity, because what the U.S. is what is it that the containment of China policy. It's just absurd, and that they've been using Australia also as a pawn in it. This big AUKUS alliance, which is basically like a NATO in Asia, that's beginning, that has been formed and that's developing. it's very scary, right? It's a similar situation, perhaps a little bit more profound in its potential development than we have with the situation with Russia. So it's if we're able to recognize, as we've had in other streams, how existential the proxy war against Russia is, how it's literally like tiptoeing humanity to nuclear Armageddon. It's the same thing with China, and just at earlier stages of the fight. Then no one wins with nuclear war. Literally no one wins, and that's what these people very clearly, our ruling class very clearly prefers to risk that in order to sustain their hegemony than lose that and admit that the world that they kept on seeing their future in is one that's not going to be there anymore. That there's a new world that's arising, and their world is dying. And that presents ambiguous conditions for us here at the heart of the empire. If we can take advantage of it, we can make a better world ourselves. If not, it can just turn uglier and uglier and uglier for us. But Cheese Guevara made a good point. He said, it's sad because most Americans are so misinformed by our state media, and they can say virtually anything and people will believe it. And that every time I encounter points like this, or the way that I think about it is almost as an attack on our humanity, because it's deeply within us to make sense of things and to understand the world. And one of the first sentences in Aristotle's Metaphysics is, all men by nature desire to know. We want to make sense of the world that we live in. And when these assholes just distort everything and force us into viewing the world in upside down ways and prevent us, as long as we're within their grip, from making sense of the world, they're thwarting our ability to be fully human.
100%. And even when, even what we're told is sort of like media skepticism, isn't right. It's it's exactly the way we're sort of trained to think about these things. Think about your typical liberal or conservative, right? They believe whatever they see on CNN or MSNBC or Kyle Kalinske or whoever on one side, and then and think that everything coming from Fox News or Tucker Carlson or or even on Joe Rogan's show is all fake on the other side. It's like a complete, it arrives from the purity fetish, but that's another thing. And then on the other side, it's the same thing in reverse, right? And it actually goes even further with conservatives who genuinely think most of the time that they are skeptical of media, right? Which is a good general way of being. But there is a disconnect in application. They are trained to only apply that to certain things, right? And not others. When really it's all the same thing over, coming from the same corporations even.
That's absolutely true. And I think insofar as that good sense nucleus of being critical of media opens a rift in people's worldview, we can pull that open. And I can't remember where it was that I saw it. It might have been in Riley's wonderful new show, I'm a Virgo. But there was this example that someone gave a teacher. He had I don't know what sort of paper it was, but it was the sort of paper that he couldn't break it. But then he cut a slit into it, and as soon as he made a very small slit, he was able to just break it with ease. And when people say, oh, I should be being critical of the media, even if it's just targeted at MSNBC or if it's targeted at Fox News, whatever it is, it creates a slit. And that's one that we can exploit and break open.
Absolutely. And I think that's really what it came down to in the debate with Drew, was he's just not critical. He just is easily believe everything. Every time I sort of got to the point of, okay, let's see if this is true or not, it ended up that a thing that he come to believe was not true. like the thing about the Toti guy, right? And the thing about the dictatorship. It's just like every single time we actually got down and we were like, okay, well, how do you actually know this? I mean, he had gotten to a point where he just assumed without any evidence whatsoever that the entire party apparatus and government of China was conspiring to lie about this specific thing with no evidence whatsoever, right? And it's not just him. Like, I don't want to pick on the kid. That happens to a ton of people, and we don't understand when we're making that assumption. And so the trick is to always be skeptical of all of it, right? If we can't do, and as Marxists, we're sort of privileged in this way because our entire method precludes such a thing, right? The ascension to the concrete forces us to get all of the context behind a given thing before we actually accept it as true.
That's absolutely right. And it's so important to understand that it's not just him. Like, this isn't a subjective issue. There's objective forces that have produced such a thing as Drew. And it's much more interesting and profound rather than just describing his flaws or correcting them in front of an audience. It's much better to be able to explain, as you did, how it is that those flaws can arise in an individual such as Drew. And I'm sure by the fact, I mean, maybe he's this honest actor and he's getting money. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not going to speculate, but for someone to feel so passionate about people in other country that he does not know, to just make his whole life into an activism for that group of people, there's got to be at least a sense of like, I care about people in there, right? Even if it's completely distorted and upside down and all that stuff. So that I think that part of what makes propaganda so successful is that it's no longer like, these are these savage Indians that we have to colonize and go civilize or whatever. They're still a part of that, right? There's the xenophobic depiction of Xi Jinping, etc. But there's always a component that plays on people that might be well-meaning and that might feel like they want to side with the downtrodden and the oppressed. There's always a component that plays on that, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what we've called atrocity propaganda. Is necessary because that's what allows the emotions of people who are susceptible to that, good people, to fall for it. And they do it in literally every single case. Like with Cuba, it's done with the people that die in the ocean. And they're like, oh my God, people are so willing to leave Cuba and to come to America, the land of the free and dreams and all this bullshit. That they'll literally jump on a boat and travel 90 miles and, risk death. And all of the context is removed. All of it completely, but it plays on people's emotions because no one wants to see people on a raft being stranded in the middle of the ocean and being, losing their life. No one wants that. But they're really good at playing on those emotions. And the form that this is usually taking as of recently is wokeism. Mm-hmm. People don't like that word, whatever, woke washing, pick your different word. But I think we agree on the concept, which is that they end up picking minorities and spinning a narrative that benefits empire and that functions as atrocity propaganda to get consent from the people from within the imperialist core, to get them to consent to the projects that imperialism wants to accomplish in these various countries. That it's got to vilify some groups and then uphold other groups as like the underdog, the victim. And we have to be attuned to this and not let them play on our emotions and show people how they can not let themselves be played with like that.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of what I was trying to do, right? And a lot of people were like, oh, you kept letting him interrupt you and you let him talk all this time and tell his stories, and that was the point. Right? I wanted him to do that. I wanted him to be able to put it all out there, and then us to look at what he said together, and together sort of point at why it didn't add up. Right? And like getting interrupted sucks. You can ask Carlos about that when he's talking to me, but it's not a big deal. For me, a lot of everything has to do with how people see us holding or carrying ourselves, right? How does a communist act? And a communist must in our era rebuild a reputation, because our reputation got tarnished by all of these middle classers and right opportunists and liberals of the last period of history. And so we need to go the extra mile every single time. We need to be completely above reproach, even when we're absolutely sure someone is approaching us in bad faith. We don't do it. We don't budge. We are always the picture of humility, the picture of forthrightness, honesty, and genuine kindness, right? Like, so if someone is actually trying to get a point across, let them say it, and then be kind about the way you go about correcting them if they're wrong. That's the way to win people over and rebuild that sort of reputation in our era. When someone thinks the word communist, they need to think the strong, honest, and forthright people that will help.
And for those of you, strong doesn't just mean being ripped or whatever. Strong, like
it
strong.
Means that too, though.
It means that, right. But
you guys should be lifting.
Physical health is important, but strength of character.
That's what I actually meant.
Another way to talk about that is just by speaking about virtue and how we can be virtuous human beings and be virtuous in a way that aligns with what it means to be a communist. And that's what we'll be talking about actually in our next class, where we're doing Aristotle's Ethics, and we're combining it. Actually, it might be the week after this, the week after this upcoming week. We're doing Aristotle's Ethics. We're combining it with writings from Lenin and Che on how communists should conduct themselves, with your walk the walk.
Let me interrupt. Sorry, how a communist should not act right there. There's a brand new version already done. It's the book version. It's longer. So if you want that, by all means, I will send it to you.
Yes. So we have those writings, and then I'm asking folks to watch Groundhog Day, because it's just a terrific Aristotelian ethical movie that if we transform that into a communist virtue ethic, I mean, it's a guy that goes from being an asshole, self-centered, egotistical, towards being just like virtue-driven, kind, empathetic, and just nice. And he wins the whole town over. And that guy, Phil, that transformation, the Phil of the end of the movie, that's how all communists should try to be. That's like the sort of communist that Che and Lenin would have asked us to be. And that's sort of the point that I want to get across. And it's kind of it's an inversion on like the image, like you said, that we have of what communism is, that we sometimes feed into. And it's not like we should condemn these people, because they're produced by a very sick society, and whatever vices that they have, they didn't just arise spontaneously. It's the society that produced them that led them to manifest the ills of society in an individualized and singularized form. But once we're conscious of that, we should be open to reflecting on how it is that we can change, redirect our character, and lead by example, so that others can be like, oh, communists are not these sorts of people that throw tantrums and that are just resentful and, whatever the case might be, that are just big babies. They're the sort of people I look up to. Like, when I'm around them, I organically look up to them. And if that's what communists are now, like a communist society sounds pretty badass. That's the sort of lead by example approach that I think we should prioritize. That I'm going to try to do that systematically, explore that systematically in that one class a couple weeks from now. But
very, very cool. Be a Bill Murray communist, right?
Bill Murray communist, yeah.
Although only Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, not Bill Murray in Ghostbusters or Ghostbusters 2. Maybe Bill Murray in Zombieland.
I like him in
Caddyshack. Bill Murray, old Bill Murray.
He's got this one movie where he's in Japan with Scarlett Johansson.
Broken Flowers.
Right? I don't think that's the one.
No.
But it's
it's like one word. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's kind of it's almost like an indie film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I found out about it because it was the video to Sex After Cigarettes' song Apocalypse, and I really liked the song. And then I Lost in Translation. There you go.
Thank you.
Such a good film. Yeah, it's a really good film. But do we want to move on to our next segment? Finish the debunking of Lyin, James Lindsey.
I do, but first I want to tell a good story about Bill Murray. So, in the 70s, he did this method acting thing, right? This was when he was on Saturday Night Live, and he got a role in a movie, which was supposed to be this big movie, and it was called Where the Buffalo Roam, I think. It was about Hunter S. Thompson, who invented this thing he called gonzo journalism, where he would take a bunch of acid and other drugs and then do news for Rolling Stone, right? This is the type of journalism Rolling Stone was putting out. But anyway, so Bill Murray's doing this part, and he's doing method acting. So he's coming into work at Saturday Night Live every day, like just stoned out of his mind on a bunch of drugs, like huffing glue and all kinds of crazy stuff. And got fired like 3 times throughout it, but they brought him back. Very, very wild. But yeah, let's go on to Lyin James Lindsey. We left off last time around the 8-minute mark. We just watched the most sort of watched part of the video, and of course it's the one on where he says basically that critical race theory is Marxism, which it's not, right? So I'd like to begin this bit by explaining why critical race theory is incorrect. It's a bourgeois theory that tries to get at a real problem, which is racism and race ideology, but in the process, it actually reinforces that race ideology, leading to more racism. Whereas the Marxist view is that the anti-racist struggle is a concrete form of the class struggle, and therefore, not just therefore, but that different sections of the working classes, the black section, the white section, the brown section, etc., are all different particular forms of the same universal, the proletariat and the reproletariat. And so for us, it is not this separate thing, like inherently separate and at odds groups of people, the way CRT frames it and begins with. So that's the main distinction. It's a distinction on how the entire world works and how people are as being. So it's nothing like the same. And I also want to add on real quick that under the guise of keeping CRT out, the Republican Party and a lot of these apparatchiks attached to it have been sneaking in all sorts of heinous, racist stuff in public schools, private ones too, but all these schools, it's really, really messed up. Like there are a few that they genuinely sort of frame slavery as beneficial to the enslaved black workers. Not joking about that. I've like seen like pictures of these textbooks. It is incredibly messed up. And so that needs to be fought, but it needs to be fought properly, right? With Marxism, with unity, rather than that separation of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, brother. And I've read the critical race theorists, and there's stuff that, because of its very empirical nature, that you can pull from it, like statistics and that sort of stuff. That's not bad. And I don't think we should like lift the mantle of banning it. That's absurd. Like, let it be taught in academia. It's one of the most relevant, forms of bourgeois thinking in our days. Why restrict that and allow others to reign free? But it's not Marxism. It's foundationally antagonistic, I think, to Marxism. It's far from being the same worldview. It approaches things completely different. And it is itself explicitly about being critical of Marxism. And oftentimes, like you said, from our analysis, I don't think that they think that this is what's going on, but from our analysis, by them eternalizing racism, reducing everything to racism, and generally holding a very pessimistic view, like folks like Derek Bell, that reinforces the very same structures which they claim to be against. Because to actually substantially oppose these structures, you can't just attack them, because they arise from something else, and their purpose is not just to reproduce racism, but to reproduce a certain set of class relations that benefits from racism, because it divides the people that allow for the real end to be achieved, the real telos of these structures to be achieved, which is profit and capital accumulation. And so if you can't explain like where these structures come from, you can't understand them, and you can't properly fight against them, because that fight requires not just fighting against those structures, but seeing the role that they play in a larger system, that in order for the structures to come down, the system as a whole needs to be tackled.
Yeah, oh, 100%. And that's precisely the issue. So there's like two different schools. There's a more idealist school and a more materialist school. But even the materialist school, at its root core, right? Its root core puts racism into an idealist mode, right? Racism is some inherent property of the brains of people deemed white, right? Which dehistoricizes it, because, that white, like Slavs and Jews were only called white, 60 years ago? Not too long ago, right? So there's that. And it's a product of their brains, right? It comes from something within them. It doesn't have a material source. Whereas Marxism shows the specific mode of American racism, as in the color line, which is the theory that Du Bois elaborates on and really, really explains perfectly. It's a product of production. It is a reflection, just as everything else regarding classes, of the forces of production in social life, right? So racism, as in the color line, and white supremacy, etc., comes into being out of slavery, right? And chattel slavery. Whereas for the bourgeois theories, including the materialist form, chattel slavery is instead a product of racism, right? It gets the cause and effect screwed up, because it's not a dialectical and materialist theory. It just isn't.
I would say instead of cause and effect, I think it gets the principle aspect screwed up, because they do end up like cause and affecting each other. They end up working then reciprocally, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a way better way to put it.
But that's what's so big about Du Bois, and even before his Marxist turn in 1935, which is more explicit, he was intuitively working with a materialist understanding of these things, which means that he saw how it was that it was the economic motives that were driving the ideology of racism, and how race science comes in a historical moment to legitimize the needs of the slavocracy and the Cotton Kingdom in the South. And it's a lot easier to legitimize literally enslaving people when you're scientifically proving that they're inferior and that there's this hierarchy, almost an Aristotelian hierarchy of being, but with the different races. So um, that's so it's and what's sad is that a lot of these people, and here's where well-meaning leftists or whatever get tripped up. A lot of these people, you see them cite their Du Bois, you see them cite their Claudia Jones, you see them cite their Frederick Douglass. You see them cite the key thinkers of the Black Freedom Movement, Martin Luther King, their Malcolm X. In some spaces, even like the leading Panther thinkers like Huey and Hampton. And then when you really investigate like the substance of each, it's completely contradictory. The substance of the people that came out of the Black Freedom Movement and were the most developed expression, the most coherent formulation of that struggle's aim and material and ideological composition, these people saw racism as a way that capitalism, something that capitalism uses to divide working people. And the point is to really understand, to get to the bottom of it, so that this artificial separation that's done by the rulers, the ruling class that exploits both white and black workers, could be overcome. The opposite is done by those who appeal and who cite these people in a very half-assed way and synecdochal manner. The opposite is done by them. They want to eternalize these relations, reduce even the profit motive and the material incentive out of which it arises, reduce it to racism. And by eternalizing it, they're able to crank out as many articles as they want about whiteness and, the eternal character of the white gaze and, the momentlessness of racist outbursts. And, whatever the case might be, it's the complete opposite. Instead of aiming to understand the material conditions that produce these rifts and looking for a way to overcome them so that you can help struggle against the material conditions that produce them in the first place, it reinforces them through a half-assed understanding of what they are, what it is that they're fighting against.
And it finds form in the purity fetish in our era, right? So rather than fight racism by uniting people of all races in the class struggle, since we all have the same enemy, etc., it becomes an individual sort of project for rich white liberals, right, to feel bad about themselves and in the process feel good about themselves, right?
Or middle class blacks.
It's so incredibly chauvinistic, like just unbelievably chauvinistic.
And ever since the Civil Rights Revolution, it's also transformed into a way for middle class, petty bourgeois parts of the black community to develop within the academy.
Right.
And it's
real quick before that,
just real quick, it's similar to how like the post-colonial theorists, right?
Mhm.
They do the same thing, but from countries outside. It's like petty bourgeois thinkers from those countries that come to the academy, and they're the big hit, and their intellectual capital is rooted in the fact that they present themselves as speaking for these masses of people that I don't even know if they could have a conversation with regular people, just because regular people, even from the communities that they can claim to speak for. I mean, I'm a trained philosopher, and sometimes I struggle to figure out what the fuck they're trying to say. When you
everything is something ality and body is like, you can't talk about racism, you talk about raciality, right?
And when you remove the hard language, it's a very simplistic and reductive language, right?
And wrong and theoretically incorrect. This is what I was getting at earlier, but bringing up post-colonialism is perfect because they have a great saying: decolonize your mind, right? Colonialism is a real concrete phenomenon in the world. You don't get over that by everybody decolonizing their mind. You get over that through class struggle, through overthrowing the compradors and the colonizing class, right? Uh, what did the bourgeois revolutionaries in the US do? They overthrew the colonizer and kicked them out, right? That in Marxism is what an anti-colonial struggle is. What did the Chinese do to the Japanese? Class struggle and kicked them out. They weren't, there weren't Japanese professors telling all of the other Japanese there to decolonize their minds. The ones who actually wanted to help the Chinese went over to the communist side, became spies, et cetera, et cetera. We got a super chat, though, from Lemonheads that I don't want to miss. There we go.
What is the most entertaining / easy theory book?
It has to be entertaining and easy.
Oh, that's tough. I'm not the right person to ask. I find like reading Hegel entertaining. So your opinion wouldn't probably.
I have it. If you can find this, Basics by Gus Hall. This is a collection of all the basic Marxism that he wrote for the old party theoretical journal, Political Affairs. It's really, really, really easy because it was designed for young cadre just beginning, right? And so, like, it's a lot of it's not even to the level of our basics of Marxism class. And it's entertaining because Hall has this really sort of Midwestern way of being that just like he gets to the point, he has fun. It's good. It's very good. I think it might be out of print.
I don't know. I guess I'll answer with easy, and yeah, I guess the manuals are pretty easy, but specifically the Konstantinov Fundamentals of Marxist-Leninist Philosophy. I assigned a chapter of it, or part of a chapter of it, to my philosophy class. And it's problematic. It's got a lot of problematic stuff in it, but it's good in terms of building a foundation that then you can like correct upon and see, okay, this was way too simplified, and it feeds into old school binaries that Marxism overcomes and all that stuff. But I think that the manuals are helpful. I can still, I do a lot of my research in dialectics and Hegel and more deeper into the water stuff, and I can still talk perfectly fine with my dad about all of this because he studied those manuals religiously in Cuba. So they work for something. That's what I'd say to go to for easy. I don't know. I don't think it's entertaining, but definitely is easy.
Stalin can be that. The Stalin's collected works are good for that. I think though, like you actually see a turn in the way over simplification happens between Stalin and the Konstantinov book. If I'm pronouncing the name right, I might not be. Because the first edition of that was written by a guy also with a K name that I'm blanking on now. But anyway, it was written in 1956, right? And that one is the 70s edition, if I'm remembering correctly, that you're referencing. But the first edition went... So Stalin has this sort of way of framing things that you can easily lead into a mistake of what we call stagism, right? That you go from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. That's the way it goes, right? And that's not in the fundamentals book, either of the, or I think there's 3 volumes, but none of them have that, which is good. But there's another new simplification, which is an over reliance on uh, the technology level of the productive forces, right? And so, like, too much of an emphasis on the objective factor rather than the subjective factor, us, right? When it's actually a relationship between the two. It's almost like they went back to an already overcome Bukharin mistake.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just my opinion. But we got to. Sometimes I think like Lemonheads just types silly stuff because he wants to donate money. Thank you, Lemonheads.
Does anti-natalism have Marxist roots? No, not at all. But Noah, do you want to take a stab at this one first?
I thought it said anti-Semitism.
No.
I don't. What's anti-natalism again?
I think he's referring, just to be sure, let me look it up.
Yeah, I'm not.
That's like anti-having babies. Anti-natalism. Yeah, anti-babies. It's the opposite of Marxism. Just a quick Google showed Schopenhauer. There's not a, I haven't seen much of it in my Schopenhauer, but if it's rooted in Schopenhauer, then it's rooted in a deep form of pessimist irrationalism.
And anti-humanism.
Right, anti-humanism, which is the philosophy of the bourgeoisie once it becomes a explicitly reactionary force. And Lukács depicts this very well in The Destruction of Reason, where pre-1848, there's still such a thing as positive revolutionary bourgeois philosophy and its culmination in Hegel and the German Enlightenment. But after 48, figures like Schopenhauer are brought back. And then you have figures like Kierkegaard and like Nietzsche, and that ends up developing in vitalism at the turn of the century, and phenomenology and existential phenomenology and all these sorts of philosophy trends that are rooted in irrationalism, that are anti-humanistic, sometimes anti-human. You had in Edward von Hartmann, one of Schopenhauer's proteges, the idea of a collective suicide, right? Mm-hmm. Which is John Bellamy Foster hinted at Zizek participating in this form of thinking when he's defending NATO so boldly and asking for bombs to be given to Ukraine. So it's the opposite of that, and in the U.S. specifically, or in the movement that ends up developing as the pro-abortion movement, you have Margaret Sanger, who tried to play it off as if she was pro-worker and her arguments were in order to make working class people's lives easier, but she was really just a fucked up Malthusian stooge, racist and anti-Semitic, but a Malthusian stooge of the ruling class. The ruling class has always been okay with Malthusianism. That's something that Engels points out already very, very early. He makes the argument, I believe, in his review of Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present in 1844. The ruling class always has a part of it that's deeply Malthusian, anti-human, and that if it could get its profits by just reducing the population as much as possible, it would definitely do that. And Margaret Sanger spinned it as, the more babies we have, the more workers in the market. The more workers in the market, the lower the wages. Therefore, we should stop having babies so that we can bargain better and have higher wages. So she spinned it as a pro-worker narrative, but it was deeply anti-human and therefore anti-worker. And her arguments against Marxism were so incredibly stupid, like so incredibly stupid. She was like one of the original like big figures calling Marxism a religion and dogmatic and horrible. I had to read her. I had to read, maybe a few dozen of her articles and speeches and a lot of her work, and it was so incredibly frustrating. And I was able to see a lot of the common sense misunderstandings of Marxism that we see today in her work. So, yeah, the opposite of Marxist roots.
Yeah, I also She, I remember she wrote like towards the end of her life something about a lot of her work in uh, abortions, right? Like getting abortions to people was based on a sort of sexual thing for her, right? So she wanted personally to be able to go have a bunch of sex. If maybe I'm remembering wrong, she was also doing things like speaking at KKK events, uh, American fascist rallies, that kind of thing, and saying, "Hey, you should support these abortion organizations because it'll get rid of all these bad races." Right? So, really, really horrible person. And that's not to say that, abortion rights aren't important in our day and age. It's a different time, different place. But yeah, I don't know. It's she's a very weird person, and we shouldn't really take her seriously. Here's my thing: if people will take assumptions, right, these common sense assumptions about Marxism, and develop entire arguments around them without bothering to check what Marxism actually is, we shouldn't be trusting anything they say, really. I mean, if someone will actually do that, that's wild. I would never write an entire paper on something I guessed. I mean, that's crazy.
Right, right, yeah. That's one of those things where it's once you see it in one place, uh, it tells you something about the person's character, and it diminishes their credibility about even the things that they're an expert in. And I just had that happen to me. I was really enjoying this just like public philosophy book. It was mainly a book that mixed in the ideas of some people with really like a history of like the existentialist movement. But it was so anti-communist and like the most like a third grader level of misunderstandings of Marxism. And there's some figures in that movement that I haven't been able to study so thoroughly, and even like some of the major figures in the movement that she should have known. There was places where I was like, and then you combine that with really stupid depictions of Marxism, and I end up finishing reading this book. It's like 330 pages, and I'm like, should I have even read that, or was it just like entertainment? Because I don't think the ideas of the people that I even that I have been able to study were correct, and I doubt that the other ones were too, regardless of how much she tells me she's like a specialist in the area or something. So
Right. I don't understand why people lie about that stuff. I really don't. Like, anyone who knows the area can tell you're lying already, right? You get people all the time. They're like, I promise you, I've read all kinds of Marx, right? And then they're like, it just doesn't work, man. It's against human nature. You can't force everyone to be equal. And it's like, why are you bothering lying to me? It's weird.
do we want to give a quick argument against anti-natalism?
Wait, that's not me. I didn't say that.
What?
The guy's named Noah. I'm being dumb.
Oh,
It's,
um,
it's
I think it's not very hard. Anti-natalism is usually rooted in an assumption that population is related to scarcity of resources, or in its environmental Malthusianism form, to the fact that the climate is changing because of the population size or whatever the fuck.
yeah.
It can lead very easily into eco-fascism. And the reality is, as Marx already showed in his utter destruction of Thomas Malthus, that uh, it has nothing to do with population, and it has everything to do with production. And that the limits, whatever we consider to be limits, are always socially conditioned by the historical epoch, both the limits of population and what we consider natural limits. So it's uh, the discourse on population is just, it feeds very easily into fascism, and it's fundamentally wrong. And the way that it is pointed to as the cause of climate change or the cause of scarcity or whatever it might be. In both cases, it is extremely wrong and based on an extremely superficial explanation that is grounded in what Marx called an imagined concrete, which is the population as an abstract, which takes no account into how that population is divided, into the relations that various groups in that population take with each other in order to produce the material subsistence of society. And it's just an extremely abstract, simplified explanation for phenomenons which are rooted in the way that we produce and relate to one another in our systems, in our modes of life.
Yeah, and another thing I just want to add a small thing to this because Carlos said almost all of it. The scarcity that they talk about, right, is scarcity of food, of basic necessities, etc. All of which we have now overcome as the human race. What leads to people going hungry, people starving, etc., is our system of production and distribution, right? There is more food thrown away every day than there are hungry people, right? There is more milk dumped out and destroyed to keep a certain price point than there are babies who need that milk, right? I mean, you can go down the list, more houses and homeless people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when they talk about population, and I was just watching a stream that you and Eddie did, watching whatever the wild guy who keeps predicting China is going to collapse, saying it's going to collapse because of the population.
Oh, God.
It's not even a well thought out thing they say, right? If you think about it and go to the stats for 2 seconds, it falls apart. Last thing on it, I'm always very, very skeptical about the people who are always talking about demographics and populations. In my experience, they're generally race realists of some sort or another. Usually the sort of Richard Spencer white supremacist types. So be careful of those kind of things. They're weird. They're all wrong, but yeah, just be careful.
So Noah then says, I think you have some assumptions in there. You can make an anti-natalist argument with nothing to do with scarcity. Benneter makes analysis based on the balance of suffering / consent. He's one of the most popular modern anti-natalist philosophers. I would say that's an even worse argument. At least the first one, people can be like, "Oh my God, yeah, but the resources and there's too many people," and you can imagine in your head like a table of food that's limited and like 30 people there, and if there's one more person, then people start going hungry. At least you could do that with that argument. But like the argument that there's so much suffering in life and people don't consent to being thrown into the world and therefore we shouldn't have kids, that's absurd. That is so incredibly absurd because look at what the fuck the suffering is rooted in. The suffering is rooted in our mode of life. It's not eternal. And what are you going to prevent like the grace of life to someone that you could give because of suffering? Like, I mean, that's not to say that individuals can make their choice. Like, pregnant mothers that are in a struggling place and they want to have an abortion, fine, right? But like systematic anti-natalism or whatever, holding it as your personal worldview, it's just very weird. Like, there's always a way to find meaning in life. Even in a very meaningless world, you find meaning by fighting that meaninglessness and fighting for a new world. And it's so yeah, I have no sympathy for that anti-natalist stuff. I just had a baby. It's a wonderful experience, regardless of the difficulties, economic or whatever difficulties there might be. It's a wonderful experience.
I don't either. And, I fight specifically because of my kids, right? To make a better world so they don't have to do the fight that I'm doing now, right? We're involved in the beginning of a revolutionary process, right? Of building a new society. And that's a big deal. And since Carlos took suffering, I'm going to take consent. Every single baby of all babies, eggs, creations of, imaginary self-sentient robots, etc., none of them have had consent in history. So is consent really such a big deal? Or is it something we make up to sound smart? I think it's something we make up to sound smart. All the anarchists are always about consent this, consent that. But when you actually get down to it, the world doesn't work the way they think it does, right? They talk about, you consent to get a job, right? That's why that's a good relationship. But we were born into this world of monopolies existing, owning everything. We have to then give them money to purchase college degrees, right? That prove that we can do the jobs that they get money off us for doing, right? All of it is set up to make them money. That ain't consent, right? So consent, not what it's cracked up to be when the anarchists go off.
It's all rooted in bourgeois contractionism. That's it. That's the myth of the bourgeoisie. There's consent, and therefore it's okay. Like, having consent doesn't mean it's okay. That's part of the argument that Foucault was giving for like being able to fuck 14-year-old kids. If they can consent, it's okay. No, it's fucking not. Consent is not everything. That doesn't mean that like if you're out drinking, you should obviously ask for consent in every fucking instance and not do people's consent. But to say that a baby can't consent to being born, therefore I shouldn't have a baby, I don't even know if that's an argument you can argue against, because it's so irrational that I doubt any normal person actually holds on to it. But Danny Knapp, thank you so much for the $5 donation. These super chats are fundamental for our institute, and we have so many new projects going on and things that we hope to do, and the funding that you guys help us with is so essential. We have no donors. It's just grassroots funded stuff. So thank you so much for giving us your hard-earned money and for having faith in us and our struggle and our role in it. But do you think the Cornell West campaign has any revolutionary potential or other usefulness for Marxists? I think the answer is a resounding yes, but I'll let you take a stab at it first, Noah, and then I'll go.
Yeah, 100%. I think West is smart. I think he's surrounded by good people. I think he's a symbol of a new era, right? And it's not just West. It's West, RFK, and Trump. The three of them talking represents a new form of politics without the old bullshit, really. And they're all going to say different things. But I want that debate. That's what I want, because it brings that debate into another level. And even with all of Trump's lies, etc., it's still a step beyond what all the Bidens and DeSantis's, etc., etc. And that's important. Now, his campaign, does it have a chance to win? Maybe. Maybe not. But if not, it doesn't matter. Our actions are the same, right? We're Marxists, and we understand change as a revolution, right? And even if West wins, it's not going to be enough to get the change we need. It's just going to be a good step in our direction, right? And we're going to keep going afterwards no matter what. So this is concretely the development of the contradictions our society is within towards their conclusion, towards revolution, either way. And he's useful for Marxists in 1,000 different ways, right? In the ways I just explained, in getting just a better, more rational message out there, even with his flaws, What do you think, Carlos?
I mean, I struggle with the language of useful for Marxists because it kind of, I don't know if it's just a Kantian um, glitch I have or something, but
No,
I don't
that's
want
a
to treat
good
him,
idea.
I
That's
don't
a
want
good.
to treat him as a means. I think he's important. And here's the thing, man. We had a big movement with the Bernie Sanders 2016 and 2020 campaign runs. I think stronger in 2016 than 2020. But what that ended up doing is awakening a whole generation, giving them a language to begin to speak about what the fuck is going on in their life and why stuff is so messed up. It wasn't the perfect language, but it was a language allowed them to articulate the things that are kind of wrong in their life in some form, whereas before that, that didn't exist. And so it brings a form of soft socialist, social democratic politics to the fore. I don't think they even live up to the social democrats themselves. I think the old school Kautskyite social democrats are even a little bit better, and that's hard to say. But um, in doing so, not only did it wake people up, but it also woke people up to the limitations of that form of soft social democratic socialism. And what we have been trying to figure out at the Institute since we were founded was how do we sublate this movement? Which means, very simply, how do we take the best parts of it and advance that forward into a higher level of politics and take the bad parts and leave it behind? And I think that Cornell West is an important moment in the sublation of the Bernie movement. One of the main things that people came out of that movement thinking was what really made us fail was running through the Democratic Party, right? People like Richard Wolff and Cornell West himself had said, okay, Bernie should run maybe in 2016 with the Democrats, and then once he builds his base, 2020 he should do independent or Green Party or whatever might be the case. He didn't do that. He lost, and a lot of people came away from it thinking the two-party system is fucked. This duopoly does not represent us, and in order to have real change, we have to run with an alternative party. I think Cornel West is going to make a splash. Polls are coming out that more than 50% of Americans are open to voting for a third party candidate. And that's absolutely huge because the one that has gotten the most attention and that's the most known is Cornel West. And this comes at a time where the popularity that Biden has, it's just extremely low. And so,
Wait,
you
let me
know,
cut in real quick, Carlos. Um, that is so important because what it's going to do is lead people to that conclusion that holy shit, the Democrats and Republicans have been not allowing anyone else access forever because it's sort of in the back of our minds at some points, but not out there, not out in the public, right? And the way it works is no matter how popular West is, even the Green Party ain't allowed to get on the ballot in every state.
but here's the thing. I think
Parties are.
I think a lot of people already knew that, right? And statistically, like they did. Um, I think what's going to make it special is that there couldn't have been a more, unless Bernie wouldn't have been the Bernie that we have now, there couldn't have been a more perfect person to try to attempt what he's doing at this moment.
Mm.
And if he, well, we have to hope, and I'm sorry to repeat an example that I gave earlier, that rug that that person tried to rip and couldn't, he tried very hard and couldn't, and then got a little scissor and snipped the tip. And as soon as the fibers were disconnected in one small area, he was able to then just rip it apart with tremendous ease. I think Cornel West could potentially make that slip. That opens up the door towards ripping the whole fucking thing apart. And what form can that take? Maybe breaking the 5% of the votes, or I don't know what form it could take. But if he makes a slit, he's already conscious of the fact that his campaign is not an end in itself. It is a moment in a revolutionary movement. Now, Cornell is not Marxist-Leninist, so we don't have pure ideological alignment with him. But that doesn't matter. He's someone who's committed to the real movement of history. He's someone who's committed to the advancement of the working class's struggle. Maybe he doesn't want a dictatorship of the proletariat, but we're so fucking far away from that he might be the guy that can even allow us to see that in the horizon. And maybe when it's visible in the horizon, he might change the way he thinks about this, right? The struggle radicalizes people, and we have not been in a moment like this ever. So, I think that he couldn't be it couldn't be more emblematic of the moment that we're in. That is essentially a crisis of empire, a crisis of legitimacy. People do not believe their leaders. They do not believe the media. They do not believe big businesses, right? They think that big businesses are out to get them, which is true. Um, and internationally, the world is turning away from the US. It's turning towards BRICS, towards China. It's leaving the US dollar. Global dollar hegemony is supposed to be plummeting. By 2030, only 30% of international trade is supposed to be in the dollar. So we're really witnessing, both internally and externally, because you cannot disconnect them, the falling of an empire. And it's developing this movement that Dr. Monteiro has called the movement of the discontented, taking shape with the MAGA movement, which we might think that its leadership is messed up and deceptive and not actually believing it. Whatever we might think of it, the people in that movement see themselves as being agents in a struggle against the status quo and against the deep state. The MAGA movement, the RFK Jr. movement, which is the same thing, I think, and the Cornell West movement, which I think is the one that's actually the most authentically anti-establishment and objectively revolutionary. So it's a tremendous step forward, and it could provide that rip that allows us to at least envision the ripping open of a fabric that for the last 100 years has been so sturdy, and we haven't even seen it move a little bit, with the exception perhaps of the civil rights revolution. But I guess we could say there was a new fabric that came after that we haven't been able to break open.
Dr. West is one of us. That doesn't mean Marxist Leninist, whatever. He's one of us. He's one of the people fighting on the side of the people. So whether he, wants a dictatorship of the working classes or not, doesn't matter, because it ain't up to him. And he knows that, right? That's why he's so brilliant here. We got a few more super chats and stuff like that going back on your big long rant there. So
Sorry.
Oh, you got it.
Lemonheads, thank you so much again for the $2. I love you guys, but this is breeder logic. I don't know. I don't.
What is breeder logic?
I think breeder logic is connected to like just breeding things, animals or breeding beings that serve a purpose for
like a dog breeder. Is that what he's like?
Right. I don't know. We're not saying it's important to make more babies so that the capitalists have more workers to exploit. Right. We shouldn't be living in a world where we're inclined to not want to have babies because of these artificial ideas about population leading to climate change, or the suffering that we endure in our everyday life is eternal and therefore we shouldn't have kids or bring them into this world. I think that we should live in a world where if people want the, quite frankly, beautiful experience of parenting, they shouldn't have to think, can I afford it? What world, how difficult is the world going to be for my kid? And you do that not by stopping having babies. You can have your babies and struggle and enjoy it, or not have them. It's up to you. But it's by fighting for a world where it's comfortable for people to make that decision and be able to say yes and not have to make those secondary questions that should never come into a couple's decision about whether they want to have a child or not.
I think a lot of those type of views, like the anti-natalism, they come out of a disbelief in change. And whereas Marx, and so they're very, very pessimistic, nihilistic, etc. But Marxism takes as its entire premise change. Everything. And if we look around and look just at empirical science, everything is always changing at all times. No matter what it is in the universe, it's always changing. Even the universe itself is constantly expanding. And not even just expanding, the rate it expands at is also always changing. Everything changes. And the way we change society is by fighting. And we fight. We're fighters here. We don't give up. All there is to it.
Let me be clear though, because I think we might have been interpreting what Noah meant by anti-natalist. Maybe he just didn't want to have a kid. If anti-natalism means that you don't want to have a kid, yeah, that's fine. That's your choice. But if when you have an ism behind something, it at least implies that you're. So if you're like part of a movement to get people to stop having kids, that's what we have a problem with. But if you as an individual do not want to have a kid, that's
fine.
your choice.
That doesn't mean you're an anti-natalist. That just means you don't want to have a kid. And that's okay.
Right.
It ain't for everybody, you know?
I think we got another super chat down here. Oh, there's a lot of scrolling. Again, Noah. I have no problem giving my money to this project and will continue. Your takes on anti-natalism seem unexamined to me, characterizing anti-natalism as deviant. It's ironic in the U.S. Marxists. Here's the thing. I don't know what you mean specifically by anti-natalism now, because at some moment it seemed to have implied being against people having babies, and another moment it seemed to have implied that you don't want to have a kid. And if you don't want to have a kid, obviously we're perfectly fine with that. We're in favor of a woman's right to have an abortion, and think it's a worthwhile fight and a part of the class struggle in some areas. But I don't think preaching to people that they shouldn't have a baby has anything to do with Marxism. I think that's actually very embedded in petty bourgeois moralism, and I'm sorry to say that, but I think it is what it is.
Yeah, let me hit this too. It may seem like it's coming unexamined from me because I've never heard of people that were against people having babies before, right? And it does. I don't know where you get deviant from. I don't think we said deviant. We don't really talk like that. But it is a very petty bourgeois sort of privileged position to have, to tell other people what to do with their lives. You think X, so they should do Y, right? That's what it is. A lot of the time, what you find is that what you're told a Marxist is in the U.S. isn't actually a Marxist. At the Midwestern Marx Institute, we take great care to genuinely view the world through Marxism, though. So we're going to sound a lot different from all the people of the last period. We're going to sound different from the media, et cetera, et cetera. But we also prove that what we are doing is Marxism, and you can go through all our classes, all our videos, and see all that.
Yeah, and again, we're not against people deciding not to have babies.
Correct.
What we're against.
I am. I think everyone should do what I did, which is have a child when you're not ready to do it yet, and it just kind of surprises you. Then I think. No, I'm just kidding.
So yeah, just to be clear, so if that's what you thought we were saying, Noah, that's definitely not. We're not condemning you for not wanting a baby. But if you're going out there and telling people that they shouldn't have babies or that they're unethical if they have babies or whatever, that we would condemn, or at least urge you not to do. Mary Estrada with a really good comment here. Thank you, Comrade Marius. West needs to appeal to both RFK Jr. and Trump supporters if he wants to make a major impact. If Trump is jailed and things are rigged against RFK in the DNC primaries, he could pick some up. That's a really, really good point, especially since, and this is a point that Eddie often makes of Trump and the Trump supporters that we've encountered, like, people support Trump's not because of, like, the more bigoted things he says, but in spite of them. They support him because of the other stuff, like the pseudo anti-establishment, anti-deep state attitudes that he's taking, and sometimes inconsistent in actually being. So, and this, I think it's the same thing for RFK Jr. Like, there's a lot of people that are supporting him that would be like, well, I would if he's criticizing big pharma so thoroughly, why isn't he in favor of like Medicare for all or something? That would be such an easy, just like it saves money, and it's it will put us on par with every other developed nation. And the same thing with the Israel question. Like, why is he such a fucking simp for an apartheid genocidal state? Like, I think the people that like him, a good bunch of them, like him in spite of those positions,
Mhm.
not because of them. And in each case, I think that opens up a really good space for Cornell West to pull from those people. And yeah, if Trump is in jail and RFK Jr. is prevented from getting the Democratic nomination, it might be really cool to see what happens, because RFK has said he's not endorsing Biden, and I'm sure he's probably more fond of Cornell West uh, or even Trump than Biden. So it could get 2024 is going to be, it's going to be a movie, man. So I
Yeah.
think it's exciting.
And they're trying to set up a debate between Cornell West and RFK on the
Mm.
Revolutionary Blackout Network,
Oh,
which,
really?
yeah, that should be really cool. I hope they can get it done. Speaking of them, though, I was talking to Nick earlier, and he invited us to next week, not tomorrow, but next weekend, go to their labor summit, which and talk about Marxism, which should be pretty cool. I'm excited about that too. I texted you about that, but you were busy at that time, so we didn't
Yeah,
end up talking about it before this. So surprise! I said yes.
that's good. Yeah, I ended up seeing it. They messaged us, and I said yes as well. So I guess we both said yes. And yeah, I'm excited. I think it's a wonderful idea. It's one that we have talked about in private before, so I'm glad someone's doing it. We toss up so many ideas that we don't have the time, energy, or resources sometimes to concretize them. So when someone else does, we love to see that, because what matters here is that someone is doing it, not that
It gets done.
that it gets done. Right. So that's extremely, extremely excited, and I'm hoping that Eddie could be a part of it. I know you've confirmed, and they just asked me as well, so I think I should be able to be a part of it unless I'm traveling. But I think it's right what we should be doing. Right, a labor summit is fucking huge. I mean, we've talked about this in private about doing something like this, so it's really cool that they're doing it. Um, and if it's an option, it might be cool to see if the institute can also be one of the co-sponsors of the event. So maybe you should reach out to Nick and see if that's a possibility. But again, the RBN folks doing such tremendously amazing work. And if I'm sure most of the people that are here are already following them, but if you're not, please go give them a subscribe. They're
Yeah.
getting hit now by censorship over some bullshit simply because they speak truth to power. And as actually, I saw this quote from Noam Chomsky's masterclass ad. It's a really good quote, actually, which is like, we shouldn't just preach truth to power or speak truth to power. We should speak to the people, which is the other component. It's not, you don't get things done by speaking to the elite and criticizing them, but by speaking also to the people and being with the people. So I think they do both of those things, and I consider both projects to be in the same tradition and fighting for essentially the same thing. So those are our brothers and sisters over there, and shout out to them.
One more thing about them, we're going to be doing a show with Nick next week. I think I want to say Thursday, where we're going to talk about censorship and the censorship that RBN's faced, the censorship we've faced, all kinds of stuff. It should be really good. So look forward to that, everybody.
Yes. And we have here another super chat. Thank you so much, Justin Watson. Again, these super chats are so important for funding the institute, and I can't emphasize it enough how important this is. But anti-natalism sounds Malthusian, not Marxist. Yeah, it is ideologically rooted in Malthusianism. Margaret Sanger was a very deep Malthusian, and there's some weird ties that she had to various elements of the most elite part of the capitalist class that was very Malthusian. And when she starts establishing those ties, the Malthusianism starts to go a little deeper in her thinking. So, yeah. But there seems to be certain forms of natalism that don't approach it, anti-natalism that don't approach it from the same angle as Sanger. I still think it's rooted in Malthusianism and not Marxist, though.
Yeah, let's go right to Lemonhead's next one.
Maybe some more Lemonheads.
I don't know what to do with him today. How did the left get co-opted by LGBTQIA plus? The left did not get Okay, so let's give a timeline of the left, though, for real. Right? The left develops as the working class movement in the US, right? And it has a whole bunch of twists and turns. The first gigantic, huge victory, though, Reconstruction. The first ever dictatorship of labor in the world. Lasted longer than the Paris Commune and happened before the Paris Commune, right? And so that's for, let's fast forward a whole bunch, color line, all these problems, blah, 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 blah. Very, very close to the Soviets' communist movement, right? That is really the leading, most advanced edge for a while is our Communist Party, headed by people like Du Bois and Winston and Foster, etc. But that closeness to the Soviets leads to dogmatism and big problems. Around this time, at the same time, the working middle classes begin coming into being, a special product of imperialism, the way the industrial proletariat is a special product of industrial capitalism, right? And so you got these professionals and working middle classes begin splitting off from the proletariat, right? And as this is happening, the working class movement is really, really getting focused on and hammered. I mean, for decades, right? First, it was because of that connection to the Soviet Union. And then it was because the Soviets weren't there to protect us anymore, right? Once that KGB money ran out, it was over. I mean, people like Gus Hall kept our party going by force of sheer will for years. But that lack of theory, that lack of education, etc., caught up to us. When the Soviets fall, so do we. And this begins a really, really dark period. During this time, and it was gaining ground over this, right? Or before this, rather, the middle class sort of replaces the working class in a leadership role on what is called the left, right? Because there was just nothing left of the movement. It was gone. Especially after the Civil Rights Revolution, which is the next big win, really. So we get to this stage where this middle class becomes synonymous with the left. And there's not many proletarians left in it. And so it's their sort of atmosphere that's set up, their ideology, which is a bourgeois ideology coming out of the institutions. Once this sort of change in ideology happens, and this is why there's not a sort of just LGBT movement, right? There is a working class movement of LGBT people and a middle class and ruling class LGBT movements, actions, etc. Right? That class struggle is primary. So, for example, lesbians, they get a lower pay than straight women, right? That is a discrimination in a concrete form of the class struggle of lesbians, right? So all of these are rooted in class. And the sort of wokeism that makes these middle class people take ownership over the people in lower class realms over it, this middle class chauvinism of theirs, comes from above. It is class struggle from above. So it's not that the left got co-opted by the the LGBT movement is that the left got co-opted by the middle class and bourgeoisie in a halfway planned, halfway not planned kind of thing. And everything follows from there. It's always, always, always class struggle.
I can do nothing but just second everything you said. That was wonderful. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, you just hit the nail on the head. I think part of what Lemonheads was trying to get at was how does the left end up sort of becoming what we call now the woke left, right? Which reduces issues of substance to issues of representation, right? And it's not able to see the sort of dialectic that could exist and does exist in socialist countries between substantive uplifting of a people and representation that reduces like emancipation to having a black Ariel on The Little Mermaid or something. And that's absurd.
It's like the meme, the Democrats dropping bombs with like, gay pride flags and BLM stickers on them.
Yeah. And I think that just to finish up a point that you made about the lack of theory, by having so much of the positions that we would take as communists come from Moscow, and again, I mean, we're both pro-Soviet, or would have been if Noah was alive at that time. I wasn't, but that didn't allow us to genuinely develop and concretize and systematize the kernels of American Marxism that was developing here. We couldn't think for ourselves. And in many ways, we were still, if we think of like the capacity of think for yourself as this process of coming to maturity and becoming enlightened, which is how like Kant defines it and what is enlightenment. We weren't enlightened yet. We were still following in many areas. And the people that were enlightened, we weren't smart enough to elevate their thought and to study it systematically and have that be like the guiding form of thought that that leads our practice and that's informed by it. So it makes us susceptible to the variety and plurality of forms of compatible lefts, controlled agents of counter-hegemony, various forms of purity fetish lefts that are developed by the empire and that are proliferated, that they're given a stage, that they're given funding and billions of dollars to the tune of billions of dollars. They're giving places in the academy and the big NGOs in the media. And all of this ends up trickling down to organizing spaces that have no solid theoretical foundation in dialectical materialism and just let whatever new ideology comes out of the academy seep right into it. And it ends up making those concretely bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideologies start being called left or working class, because they're really good at like doing this, as we spoke earlier with critical race theory, while like citing Du Bois or citing Claudia Jones or Louise Thompson and these great communist black women and black right, which are really American heroes and genuine theoretical theoretically brilliant people. They always reduce them to, oh, it's a black, it's this. Can we just say they're brilliant? But right. They are in this tradition anyways. But they do that. And so it's got the appearance and the superficial form of being like rooted in these traditions. And it presents itself as an advancement upon these traditions. But in reality, it's bourgeois thinking in an era where the bourgeoisie has to get smarter than ever before, because its contradictions are more profound than they've ever been and more pronounced than they've ever been. And what it's got at stake to lose is more than it's ever had to lose. So that's how it ends up becoming that. So it's, yeah, but that's a good question.
I want to add one more thing. These forces of the bourgeoisie and the remnants of the middle class, objective, like materially speaking, they're right-wing forces. They're supremely conservative, interested in conserving the status quo of right now. They do not want this moment to change. and it is. And it's slipping away from them, making them into reactionaries. Just so you know, this is what's going to be going on. That was a really, really great thought-provoking question, even wrapped up in a joke like that, though. Thank you, Ross.
Ross, the sugar daddy of the Midwestern Marx Institute, Ion Coyle, my good friend. We share a lot of philosophy stuff back and forth. So it's really good to have someone that I can share random philosophy shit to that oftentimes has nothing to do with Marxism, and it's just for pure pleasure, the pleasure of a weirdo at least, or a mutual weirdo who likes these deep philosophical questions that are often divorced from Marxism, but often not as well. So now I have the class that I can do that with. We set up a Discord, and I'm sending them all sorts of articles from open access philosophy journals that really have nothing to do with They do kind of have something to do with like Marxism because we should critique them, but they're still, at least for me, interesting to read. And I don't know if I say this enough, but most of my reading is like outside, and I do a ton of reading within the tradition, but I do so much reading outside that I just enjoy it. I like reading things that after a sentence I'm like, this is so wrong, but there's a kernel here, and that's why that kernel appeals to people. And I think that that helps me navigate some waters easier because people just can't slip. Oh, but you haven't read this person by me. But yeah, anyways. Thank you so much.
While we're on the subject, if anyone is interested in helping the Institute, patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. We also have a Buy Me a Coffee. Carlos was saying this earlier. It really, really does get it all done around here. That like little bit from you guys here and there, that's how we get by. We have no funding whatsoever. Except for the fundraiser we're going to be doing. That should be really fun. But that's how we get equipment. That's how we get these projects done. That's how we have a thing coming up that I don't want to spoil yet, but it's going to involve Thomas Riggins, and that should be really, really, really cool. I don't want to say too much, but yeah. Thank you all for that, and also like the stream. That helps too. We get suppressed. It's not even funny. I mean, come on. You know about us in TikTok. They do not like us.
And also, if you want to donate to yours truly, Noah Krashivik, you can now officially donate to him directly through our selfie store. You have the option to donate however much you want, and this would be for his Marxism school. He's been volunteering, teaching the Marxism school for basically free, and it's gotten tens of thousands of views altogether, and he really hasn't, made any money off of it. So if you want to help our brother get by, please do send them some donations if you can. He's been doing a tremendous job with that class. It's so pioneering of really where we want the Institute to head. And it's taught so many people, and just the reviews from both the students and the people online that have been able to catch the lives have been tremendously good. So if you can spare a few bucks and you feel like you've benefited from those classes, consider donating to the Noah Fund. And it was before we realized that it might be best to have the sorts of placement buy-ins, but I think for the basics of Marxism class, we wanted it to be public and as lowest charge as we can. But
yes.
I mean, the Bolsheviks sold their magazines, because it's important to fund the revolution. We are living in capitalism, and the stuff that it takes to produce this and to have the time to produce it, it all costs money. So we really, really appreciate whenever you guys have, feel like you could donate to us, and that helps tremendously. And it's a big boost for us to feel like you guys have faith in the role that we can play in developing the class struggle in our country. So
1,000%. And hopefully it'll get me some lighting here so the background isn't orange and I'm not all like flushed out. I'm not actually this like weird and pale, I promise.
That's true.
Really bad lighting. Like my grandparents are very brown people. I'm not this pale.
The selfie you sent me for the Pavlou debate, I was like, holy shit, Noah's tan as hell. He looks very pasty.
That's how I actually look.
Oh, man. But thank you so much, Christopher Romero, for the movement of American Marxism and to fund Noah's collection of pens without which he could not point. The legendary Noah point. We got to get those on a shirt as soon as we can. I would love to walk around.
My wife just got me a bunch of these are my favorites, right? These Pilot G3 or G2s, because what happens is they glide across a page, and I like if you see my desk, it's just notes upon notes upon notes because I have a problem with my memory, so I'm constantly writing things down, and so like I have just scraps of paper, and if it's not on a pad, like a regular ballpoint pen doesn't work well, and I'm like giving you guys all this very boring pen information, but yeah, Noah's pens are always G2s.
It's his pen specialist. I remember I had my first philosophy teacher. He wouldn't ever write if it wasn't with number 3 pencil.
A number 3, really?
Yeah, skipped number 2. It was always number 3 because even though the lead would come out lighter on the paper, it would never break. So he was able to write as fast as he wanted to and as hard pressing down as he wanted because it wouldn't break. It was stronger lead. But yeah. Well, thank you so much to all of those that have watched. Thank you, of course, Noah, for being with me here today. Thank you for those who donated. If any of you are interested in supporting the Institute financially, make sure to become a Patreon. You can find us at www.patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. You can also check out our bookstore. That helps us. And stay tuned to classes. We have upcoming classes. We have some upcoming classes. We should have one pretty soon by Professor Danny Shaw. And I think that Noah will also be revamping his class as well. And I should be doing the same. I'll probably be doing a different class, not just a history of philosophy class. So expect more of the Marxism School. And again, thank you so much for supporting us. Noah, any final words?
I love you all. Thank you. Have a great night.
All right. See you all.
Redistribution of political and economic power.